Lila had always dreamed of a slower pace of life, far from the chaos of the city. So when she and her husband, Mason, found a quaint old house in the small town of Harrowville, it felt like a dream come true. The house, nestled on the edge of the woods, was a vision of rustic charm with its creaky wooden floors, tall, narrow windows, and winding staircase that led to a darkened attic they'd yet to explore. But there was a strange chill in the air, a coldness that lingered even when the summer sun poured through the windows. Mason brushed it off as character, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Their first night in the new home, as they unpacked boxes, Lila felt a prickling on the back of her neck. She brushed it off as nerves, but when she glanced out the window, she saw something that stopped her cold. Across the street, partially hidden by a thick tree branch, was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, with a face shadowed by the dim streetlight. He stood motionless, staring straight at their house. Lila's stomach twisted with unease. She nudged Mason, gesturing to the window. He squinted, but then shrugged. "Probably just a curious neighbor," he said with a chuckle. "Small towns, right? They like to know who's moved in." But there was something unnatural about the man's stillness, the way his gaze seemed fixed solely on their window, never wavering. Lila decided to close the blinds, feeling an odd sense of relief as the fabric blocked out his figure. But even with the blinds drawn, she couldn't shake the image of that face in the shadows. It haunted her thoughts as she drifted to sleep that night, a persistent feeling of being watched settling over her. The next morning, Lila awoke feeling uneasy, the memory of the shadowy figure from the night before still fresh in her mind. She decided to head into town to gather some supplies and, more importantly, learn a bit more about her new neighbors. She walked down the sleepy main street of Harrowville, the sidewalks lined with faded storefronts and quiet, watchful eyes. It felt as though the whole town was moving at half speed, every glance lingering just a little too long. At the corner of the street, Lila spotted an old library with a dusty, hand-painted sign hanging from the door. Curiosity got the best of her, and she stepped inside. The library was dim, filled with the scent of aged paper and leather-bound books. An elderly woman with white, wispy hair and thin glasses sat behind the desk, her gaze piercing as she looked up from her book. "You're new around here, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a flicker of recognition in the woman's eyes, as if she knew more about Lila than she let on. "Yes, my husband and I just moved in across from an older man," Lila stammered, unsure of how much to reveal. "He seems to watch our house at night." The librarian's expression shifted, her eyes darkening as she closed her book with a deliberate thud. She sighed, as if burdened by the weight of something unspeakable. "You're talking about Abel Reed's house," she said in a hushed tone. "He was one of the oldest residents here. Strange man, kept to himself, and one day he just vanished." Lila's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected such a chilling response. "What happened to him?" The librarian leaned forward, her gaze locked onto Lila's. "No one knows. One day he simply disappeared and no one's lived in that house since. Some say they still see him wandering around at night, watching, waiting." Her voice trailed off, leaving an unsettling silence that made Lila's skin crawl. Lila swallowed, feeling the room grow colder. She couldn't shake the feeling that the librarian knew more than she was saying, but pressing further felt dangerous. The librarian gave a slight nod as if warning her to tread carefully. "If you see him again," she whispered, "it's best to pretend you don't." That night back at the house, Lila closed the blinds tightly, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind buzzed with the librarian's words, and a terrible question echoed in her thoughts. What if he's not just watching? As the days passed, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house. Strange noises started echoing through the halls, soft footsteps, faint whispers, and the occasional sound of scraping metal. She tried to convince herself it was just an old house settling, but each night felt more oppressive, as if something was pressing in around her, watching her every move. One evening, as she was washing dishes alone in the kitchen, she heard a creak behind her. Turning slowly, she saw nothing but the darkened hallway stretching into the shadows. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling, and returned to her task. Suddenly, a flicker caught her eye. The hallway light was dimming and flickering erratically, plunging her in and out of darkness. "Lila? Everything okay?" Mason's voice called from upstairs, snapping her out of her panic. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to sound calm. "Yeah, just a power glitch, I think," she replied, but her heart was racing. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Lila could hear faint sounds coming from the attic, the sound of something heavy being dragged. She nudged Mason, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "It's just the wind, Lila. Go back to sleep." But Lila knew what she'd heard. Unable to rest, she got up and made her way toward the attic stairs, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. She hesitated at the base of the stairs, hearing that same scraping sound from above. Taking a deep breath, she climbed, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the top, she aimed the flashlight across the attic, scanning the empty space. Dust particles floated in the beam of light, and everything was silent, until a whisper floated through the air, faint but unmistakable. "Leave." Lila staggered back, her heart pounding. The word seemed to echo in her mind as she scrambled down the stairs, the ominous feeling intensifying with every step. The next morning, Lila couldn't shake the chilling events of the night before. Determined to find answers, she decided to investigate the attic during the day, when the light might make the space feel less oppressive. She climbed up, flashlight in hand, scanning the area carefully. In a far corner, hidden behind a stack of forgotten boxes, she found an old dusty journal. Its cover was worn, with a name scrawled in faded ink, Abel Reed. She opened it carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages filled with shaky handwriting. As she read, she felt a growing sense of dread. The entries were fragmented, disjointed, filled with paranoid ramblings about the watchers and the voices. Abel had written about feeling trapped, unable to leave, as if something was holding him there, binding him to the house. The final entry sent chills down her spine. "I can see them. Every night they come closer. They watch me. Soon I will join them." Lila's hands shook as she closed the journal. It was clear now. Abel hadn't left. He was still here, bound to the house. She had to tell Mason, but she feared he wouldn't believe her. How could she convince him that their new home was haunted? That night, she hid the journal in her bedside table, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed Abel's final words over and over. She felt like she was being watched, a heavy presence pressing down on her. She clung to Mason, terrified of what the night would bring. Unable to endure the haunting silence any longer, Lila decided to confront the figure. When she saw him standing across the street that night, she gathered her courage and opened the door, stepping onto the porch. "Who are you? What do you want?" she called out, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but his head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. In the dim moonlight, she could see his gaunt features, hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. A chill ran down her spine as he took a single step forward. A cold breeze whipped through the yard, and she felt the air grow thick with malice. Suddenly, Mason appeared beside her, finally seeing the figure for himself. "Lila, what is this?" he whispered, fear creeping into his voice. The figure took another step closer, his gaze never wavering. The pressure around them grew unbearable, and Lila could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched Mason's arm, backing away. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely audible. "We can't stay here." But as they turned to retreat inside, the door slammed shut, trapping them outside with the figure moving closer with each step. Lila and Mason rushed to the car, desperate to escape the presence that was inching closer. But as they fumbled with the keys, the figure was suddenly right in front of them, blocking their path. his expression twisted in a grotesque smile. They both froze, terror paralyzing them as his hollow eyes seemed to bore into their souls. Without warning, the figure reached out, his hand passing through the car door as though it were mist. Lila screamed, feeling a cold grip on her wrist, pulling her toward him. She struggled, kicking and screaming, her heart racing as she fought against the pull. Mason, panicked, grabbed her other arm, yanking her back with all his strength. In a final act of desperation, Lila whispered a plea, praying for escape. Just as she felt herself slipping, the figure's grip loosened and he faded into the darkness. Lila and Mason stumbled into the car, locking the doors behind them. As they sped away from the house, she looked back, half expecting to see the figure standing in the driveway watching them. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent, but Lila knew they hadn't seen the last of him. In Harrowville, some spirits could never truly be. After years of city life, Sarah and Jacob dreamed of a peaceful, quiet life in the countryside with their young daughter Emma. When they found a charming old house at the edge of a forest in the small town of Graybrook, it seemed like the perfect escape. Their closest neighbors were miles away, and the only sounds around were birds chirping and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. But the very first night, Sarah couldn't sleep. A strange sensation kept her awake, like an itch in her mind. She stared out the window, peering into the dark woods. Just as she was about to turn away, she thought she saw movement, something or someone lurking among the trees. The next morning, she brushed it off as her imagination, blaming the move for her restlessness. She was determined to settle in and make the best of this fresh start. But that lingering feeling wouldn't leave her. Every time she looked into the forest, it felt like there were eyes staring back. A few days later, while Jacob was at work, Sarah took Emma out to explore the yard. The little girl played happily in the garden, picking flowers and chasing butterflies. As Sarah watched her daughter laugh and run around, she felt at ease for the first time since they'd arrived. But as she glanced toward the woods, her heart skipped a beat. She could see a shadowy figure standing just inside the tree line, watching them. She squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was as though the figure was absorbed by the shadows, fading in and out of view. Trying not to panic, Sarah scooped up Emma and went back inside, locking the doors and closing the curtains. She didn't want to alarm her daughter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, she told Jacob what she'd seen. He laughed it off, telling her that the mind can play tricks, especially in a place so isolated. But Sarah knew what she saw, and the unsettling sensation in her chest remained, gnawing at her. Over the next week, strange things started happening. One night, Sarah heard the sound of faint footsteps just outside their bedroom window. She lay in bed, frozen with fear, listening to the soft crunching of leaves, only inches away from where she slept. The following morning, they found strange symbols scratched into the bark of the trees at the forest's edge. Jacob shrugged it off, saying it was probably just kids messing around. But as the days passed, more symbols appeared, each one more intricate than the last, always closer to the house. The strange occurrences kept piling up. Sarah would hear whispers when she was alone, soft murmurs carried by the wind, just on the edge of comprehension. She felt as though something was trying to communicate with her, but she didn't understand the language. One chilly evening, Jacob noticed footprints in the dirt, circling their house. At first, he thought they were his own, but as he inspected them closely, he realized they didn't match his shoe size or pattern. The footprints seemed to come from the forest, walking a slow, deliberate path around the property before returning to the trees. Jacob tried to laugh it off, telling Sarah it was probably just someone passing through, maybe a hunter or a hiker, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. That night, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, Jacob confessed that he, too, had started feeling like they were not alone. They both sat in silence, the only sound coming from the crackling fireplace, as they felt an unspoken understanding settle between them. Something, or someone, was watching. One night, Unable to sleep, Sarah ventured out to the back porch with a flashlight. She felt a pull toward the woods, an urge to confront whatever it was that haunted her every waking moment. She shone the flashlight toward the forest, the beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was suffocating. Just as she was about to turn back inside, she heard it. A soft, distant whisper. The words were indistinct, but she felt them crawl down her spine. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from all directions, blending into an eerie chorus. She felt rooted in place, unable to move as the whispers closed in. Then, just as quickly as they had started, the whispers stopped, leaving her in an oppressive silence. She stumbled back inside, heart pounding, realizing she had been closer to the Watcher than ever before. A few nights later, Jacob had to work late, leaving Sarah and Emma alone in the house. As she tucked Emma into bed, she felt the familiar sense of unease creeping over her. She tried to shake it off, whispering comforting words to her daughter before retreating to her own room. As she lay in bed, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside coming closer and closer. Her pulse quickened as she held her breath, straining to hear. Just as she was about to get up, she saw it. A pale face pressed against the window, staring at her with cold, hollow eyes. Sarah screamed, stumbling back from the window, her heart racing. She called Jacob, but his phone went to voicemail. Alone and terrified, she clutched a flashlight and locked every door and window in the house. The face appeared at different windows throughout the night, following her every move. A silent presence that filled her with dread. She realized there was no escaping the Watcher. He was here, bound to the woods, and he would not stop until he got what he wanted. The day after the face at the window, Sarah was done ignoring the signs. She insisted they pack up and leave Graybrook. But as they prepared to leave, they noticed something terrifying. Deep claw marks on the front door and a note scrawled in red paint, or perhaps something worse that read, "You cannot leave." Jacob dismissed it as a prank, saying someone in the town must have heard their plan and was trying to scare them. But Sarah knew better. This was no prank. The writing looked jagged and frenzied, as if whoever, or whatever, had left it behind was desperate to send a message. The weight of dread pressed down on them as they continued packing, the clock ticking ominously toward nightfall. That evening, Jacob went to town to gather a few last supplies, promising he'd be quick. But as the hours ticked by, he didn't return. Sarah's calls went unanswered, each one increasing her terror. She glanced out the window, where the forest seemed to have crept closer than ever before, its twisted branches clawing toward the house. Desperate, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and ventured out toward the forest, calling for Jacob. As she neared the tree line, a chilling silence settled over everything. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She shone her light into the woods, where shadows flickered and danced as if they had lives of their own. And then, she heard it. Jacob's voice, weak and echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. She hesitated, every fiber of her being screaming at her to turn back, but she couldn't leave him behind. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was swallowed by the darkness of the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, and every shadow felt alive, watching and waiting. She called out, her voice barely a whisper, and then, in the distance, she saw him. Jacob, standing perfectly still, his back turned to her. Relieved, she rushed forward, but as she drew closer, she froze in horror. Jacob's face was blank, his eyes unfocused, staring straight ahead as if he didn't see her at all. He murmured something over and over in a voice that wasn't his own. "You belong to the woods now." Suddenly, something cold and unseen brushed past her, pulling her further into the woods. The whispers she'd heard before grew louder, now distinct voices calling her name. Shadows darted around her, each one growing closer, reaching out with twisted skeletal fingers. Sarah staggered back, pulling Jacob by the arm, but he remained limp, his feet rooted to the ground. In a flash of clarity, she realized what was happening. The forest wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off of those who dared to trespass. The symbols on the trees, the whispering voices, the figure at the window, they were all warnings. This forest wasn't just a habitat, it was a trap, one that no one escaped. With one last desperate tug, Sarah broke free, abandoning the entranced Jacob as she ran back to the house. Her heart hammered as she slammed the door shut. But she knew it was only a matter of time before the forest would reclaim what it had claimed. As dawn broke, the forest appeared calm, almost peaceful, as if it hadn't swallowed Jacob whole. But Sarah knew better. She gathered Emma and left the house, clutching her daughter tightly as they walked the deserted road toward town. Behind her, she felt the weight of the forest watching, biding its time. When she finally reached the town and told her story, the townspeople just shook their heads. They warned her that the house was cursed, that many had come to Graybrook only to vanish without a trace. The house was rumored to be a lure, drawing in the curious, the restless, and the hopeful, only to feed the entity that lurked in the woods. Unable to go back, Sarah left town with her daughter, the memory of the forest's chilling grip forever etched in her mind. As they drove away, she glanced back one last time, and for a brief moment, she could have sworn she saw Jacob standing at the edge of the trees watching, his face blank and his eyes devoid of recognition. She knew in that moment that the forest had claimed him and that it would continue to wait, hungry for its next visitor. After months of searching, Ryan finally found the perfect apartment in a quaint, older building in a small town just outside the city. It was affordable, spacious, and had an almost vintage charm with its creaky wooden floors and high ceilings. The landlord was an older woman named Mrs. Grayson, who'd been managing the building for decades. Her only warning to Ryan was to keep noise to a minimum, particularly at night. Eager to start fresh, Ryan moved in without a second thought. But within the first few days, he noticed strange things. Cold drafts despite the summer heat, faint sounds of footsteps pacing down the hall, and an eerie feeling of being watched, especially in his bedroom. But he brushed it off as his mind playing tricks. After all, he had been under stress with the recent move. As he settled in, the unusual occurrences grew harder to ignore. One evening, as Ryan lay in bed, he heard whispering, soft and unintelligible but unmistakably close, as though coming from the walls themselves. He froze, his eyes darting around the dark room, trying to pinpoint the source. The whispers seemed to ebb and flow, growing louder before fading into silence. The following night, he was woken by the same whispering, but this time, it was accompanied by a gentle tapping sound, like fingers drumming against the wall. He tried banging on the wall, hoping to scare off whatever was causing it, but the tapping continued, relentless and rhythmic. When he confronted Mrs. Grayson the next morning, she only shrugged, giving him a knowing look. "This building is old, dear," she said. "It has a life of its own." Her words, though meant to comfort, only unsettled him further. One night, after a long day at work, Ryan returned home to find the hall dimly lit, casting long shadows along the worn carpet. As he neared his door, he felt a chill down his spine. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, a tall, gaunt man dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. His face was obscured by shadow, but Ryan could feel the figure's gaze boring into him. Frozen, Ryan blinked, and in that instant, the figure vanished. Shaken, he entered his apartment and locked the door, checking every corner to ensure he was alone. But as he lay in bed that night, he felt the oppressive presence once more, lingering just beyond his bedroom door. Determined to find answers, Ryan began asking his neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange. Most of them avoided his questions, but an elderly tenant on the first floor finally relented. She told him that years ago, a man named Mr. Harlan had lived in his unit, a reclusive man who rarely left and had been found dead in the apartment after months of silence. Since then, rumors of strange happenings had plagued each tenant who dared live there. A week later, as Ryan prepared for bed, he noticed something strange in his bathroom mirror. At first, It was just a faint shadow, but as he stared, the shadow began to take form, a face slowly materializing behind him, staring with hollow, unblinking eyes. He spun around, but no one was there. Heart pounding, he turned back to the mirror, only to find the face had grown clearer, its expression twisted in a grimace of anger or pain. Every night after that, the face returned, each time more vivid, more detailed. Ryan became obsessed with the mirror, unable to look away, as though the figure's gaze held him captive. He barely slept, haunted by the vision of that face watching him, growing more tangible with each passing night. Desperate for help, he reached out to Mrs. Grayson again, demanding an explanation. Her face paled, and she muttered something about restless souls. She urged him to leave, saying the building was no place for someone sensitive to the paranormal. But Ryan, now both terrified and fascinated, refused. He felt a strange, morbid need to uncover the truth of Mr. Harlan's fate. Driven by a need for answers, Ryan began exploring every inch of his apartment, knocking on walls and checking for any hidden spaces. Late one night, he noticed a faint outline of a door behind his closet, a hidden room he'd never noticed before. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, he pried the door open, revealing a small, windowless space filled with dust-covered belongings. As he sifted through the room, he found old photographs, letters, and a worn journal that had belonged to Mr. Harlan. The entries were haunting, detailing Harlan's descent into madness as he claimed to be haunted by a dark figure that watched him from the shadows. In his final entry, Harlan wrote that he had invited the entity in to understand its purpose, a choice he seemed to regret deeply. Realizing he was reading the words of a man consumed by the same horror he now faced, Ryan felt a chill settle over him. He backed out of the room, but the door wouldn't shut as though it had a mind of its own. The faint whispering returned, growing louder and more menacing, echoing Harlan's words. "I invited it in." Ryan knew he had to leave, but every time he tried, an overwhelming sense of dread kept him rooted to the spot. He felt as though something was pulling him back, urging him to stay. He began seeing the figure everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, even in his dreams. The apparition's face twisted into a look of rage, as though furious that Ryan was trying to escape. One night as he gathered his belongings, the lights in his apartment flickered, and the room grew cold. The figure materialized before him, more real than ever. Its hollow eyes glared at him, and in a voice that sounded both like Harlan's and something far darker, it whispered, "You belong to me now." Ryan stumbled back, feeling his strength drain as the figure drew closer. In a final act of desperation, he hurled the journal at the apparition, shouting, "Take this, I don't want it." The figure hesitated, its gaze shifting to the journal, before it slowly faded away, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Shaken and exhausted, Ryan fled the apartment, leaving behind everything he owned. To this day, he refuses to speak of the building or the horrors he encountered. But whenever he closes his eyes, he sees the face of the ghostly tenant watching him, waiting for the day he might return.